Meet Jennie June. Jennie June lived in New York in the 1890s and early 1900s, and she wrote a book about her life, The Autobiography of an Androgyne. And what exactly is an androgyne? Well, androgyne is another word for hermaphrodite. This is an old idea, as you can see. Now, Jennie June was not quite like that. Physically, she was a normal man, but she felt she was a woman's soul imprisoned in a man's body. And she believed that her body was partly feminine. To illustrate, she posed for this picture to be compared with this classical statue. So there you have it. That was her understanding of herself, Jennie June the androgyne. In fact, her usual term for herself and her friends was fairy, which she didn't think was a bad word, so don't be shocked when you hear it in this story. Now, about the byline. Ralph and Earl were names for her outwardly male everyday self, and Jennie June was her female impersonation name. But they were all the same person, and they were all false names. Jennie June never revealed her real-life legal name. As the story unfolds, I will be switching from one name to another, or changing pronouns from he to she, or from her to him, depending upon what is happening in our author's life. But it will be mostly Jennie June. So then, the life of Jennie June. This is Jennie June as a baby. She was born in 1874 in a little town in Connecticut. She was heartbroken when she had to give up her baby dress and wear trousers. And now for a while we'll use the name Ralph. Ralph liked to play with dolls. He couldn't catch a ball. The other boys called him Miss Nancy. But he was a model student and he wanted to be a missionary, so his parents sent him to college. In the fall of 1891, at the age of 18, Ralph arrived in New York to begin his studies. The autobiography does not name the college, but it is easily identified as Columbia by its location near Hell's Kitchen. Columbia was still just a college in those days, not yet a university. It was located where Rockefeller Center is today. That is St. Patrick's Cathedral in the background. The school was old and venerable, but it had a dynamic new president, Seth Lowe, who had grand ambitions for Columbia and for himself. Ralph was a good student, and he devoted his spare time to the city missions, that is to say, the slums. The worst slums in the city were in the 5 Points, where Chinatown and Little Italy are today. They attracted tourists, but they were so dangerous that the tourists needed police escorts. Two of the most sinister streets radiating from the 5 Points were Mulberry Street and the Bowery. Ralph found the missionary work disturbing. In the autobiography, Jennie June says, "Possible ways of gratifying my sensual desires began to haunt me. Occasionally, while walking the streets, I was powerfully constrained to embrace every young ruffian I met. I felt that I would gladly give up everything else in order to pass the rest of my days in the worst slums of the city, in the company of the most vicious and degraded of mankind. At the same time, I often had to sob violently when I would have a mental vision of myself given up to a life of shame in the slums in order to give free rein to my carnal desires." By spring, Ralph tried a late-night walk into the tough areas of town, but he just got beat up and robbed, and so his freshman year ended. In the fall of 1892, he returned to school for his sophomore year, and then one day, he summoned up his courage and made his way to dark and dangerous Mulberry Street. Here's what happened next, in Jennie June's own words. If the reader had been on Mulberry Street on an evening in November of 1892, he would have seen meandering slowly along a short and slender youth between 18 and 19. As he walks along, whenever he meets any robust, well-built young man of about his own age who is alone, he is seen to stop and addressed to him a few words. Finally, on the corner of Broome and Mulberry Streets, he addresses a tall, muscular, splendid specimen who continues in conversation with him and walks along by his side. Then the autobiography continues. If we watch closely, whenever the pair passed under a shadow, we would have seen the little one throw his arms rapturously around the neck of his big companion and kiss him passionately. They finally pass out of sight down one of the dark covered alleys leading to tenements in the rear. Jennie June's new friend was called Red Mike, and he told her to come around again. She could find him on this block anytime. Once safely home again, Ralph panicked. He immediately consulted the city's most prominent specialist on sexual matters, the noted venereologist Dr. Prince A. Morrow. Dr. Morrow examined him and advised marriage as a sure cure for abnormal passion. Ralph rejected that advice. Next, he sought out an alienist, Dr. Robert Newton. Dr. Newton's approach was try everything. He tried electrical stimulation of the brain and spinal cord. He tried hypnotism. These pictures are not Ralph, but they will give you the idea. Dr. Newton also tried drugs. Jennie June tells us what happened next. Over 5 months after my previous visit, I again found myself on Mulberry Street, corner of Grand. I have always suspected that I was inclined to this particular quest by an aphrodisiac. On or about that day, my physician administered a new drug. He probably hoped it would incite me to seek normal relations, but it acted upon the lines of my peculiar instincts. And Jennie June went back to Mulberry Street looking for Red Mike. Jennie June considered that visit to Mulberry Street the beginning of her career as a fairy. In the spring of 1893 and through her junior year of 1893-94, Jennie June partied every week with Red Mike and his friends. The gang's regular hangout was in the arches of the loading docks of a warehouse at Mulberry and Grand, so Jennie June called them the Arch Gang. She had a regular routine. She would go to Center Street at this old market and hide her keys and car fare home. By the time Jennie June was writing her memoirs, the old market had been replaced by this magnificent police headquarters. Jennie June joked that her readers should contribute pennies for a bronze tablet to be placed there. The tablet would say, "On this site, some of the earliest female impersonations of the adult Ralph Werther were staged." His debut as an adult impersonator at the age of 19 took place at the arched portal of the warehouse around the corner of Mulberry Street, 200 feet east. And if you go to Mulberry and Grand today, sure enough, you will find the old warehouse in the arches, now a pizza parlor. So Jennie June and her friends socialized once every week. This is her description of their parties. With half a score of young men and 2 or 3 young women, an evening would be spent in some humble 2-room apartment. The only refreshment was beer, the 3-quart pail passing around the room from mouth to mouth and being repeatedly sent out to be refilled. We sang plantation songs, Old Black Joe, Uncle Ned, etc. The young men petted and babied me. The girls were not jealous of me, especially because I was the one who financed these parties. The girls thought nothing strange of me, as the nature of fairies was well known to them. I wish it understood, however, that these gatherings were no more indecent than a children's party in the best social stratum. Even these Knights of Mulberry Street had their sense of decency. Extreme intimacies were allowed only in private. Everybody was exceedingly happy, and I, perhaps the happiest of all, sitting now in one young man's lap, now in that of another. And how we all did sing. By her senior year, 1894 and 1895, Jennie June had outgrown the untutored nights of Mulberry Street. She craved sophistication and elegance, and she found them on the Rialto. The Rialto was a strip along 14th Street from Broadway to 3rd Avenue. This is Jennie June's own photograph. She captioned it, 14th Street Rialto, stamping ground of the hermaphrodites. Her photo shows the Academy of Music at 14th and Irving Place. Here is a better picture of the Academy. It was just across the street from Luchow's, the famous restaurant. The Rialto was a theater and entertainment district, but it also had a political dimension. Look again at Jennie June's photograph. Notice the building on the right. That is Tammany Hall, clubhouse of the political machine that ran New York. Here is a picture with Tammany Hall in the foreground and the Academy of Music in the distance. Not far away was the Hoffman House at 25th and Broadway, where Boss Tweed, the head of Tammany, once lived. Tweed was long gone in 1894, but the Tammany crowd still schemed and socialized there. Among other things, Hoffman House was famous for racy art, especially the scandalous Bouguereau painting of nymphs capturing a satyr, admired by such connoisseurs as Buffalo Bill Cody and Grover Cleveland. Of course, it was a magnet for tourists. By the time Jennie June arrived on the scene, the Rialto and Tammany were in decline. Elite entertainment, namely the Metropolitan Opera and the Philharmonic, already had moved uptown, and theater was migrating to Times Square. But vaudeville and melodrama still flourished on the Rialto, as did museums for men only, drinking palaces, gambling joints, pool rooms, beer gardens of ill repute, and worse. Naturally, it was a favorite promenade of fairies. So Jennie June's new routine was weekly visits to 14th Street. She made her headquarters the ladies' parlor of an establishment she called the Hotel Comfort. When she tired of strolling, Jennie June would sip sarsaparillas there. Ladies' parlors did not exclude men. It just meant that a certain level of decorum was expected. At the Hotel Comfort, Jennie June tells us, nearly all the patrons were under 30, all were refined and orderly, and absolutely all were high flyers sexually. I have never circulated among more delightful people, she says. At the Hotel Comfort, she would be surrounded by a circle of beaux, and she would do her impersonation of a prima donna or break into song. The Old Oaken Bucket, or Sweet Rosie O'Grady, or After the Ball Was Over. She's only a bird in a gilded cage. Jennie June did not wear women's clothing in public. That was illegal and dangerous. Instead, she wore the fairy uniform. The most conspicuous feature was a floppy bow tie, a vogue inspired by Oscar Wilde. She tells us how she dressed for her female impersonation sprees. As a high-class fairy, I sought to dress in a distinctive manner so as to be more readily recognized by my prey. Therefore, unusually large neck bows and white gloves. The excessive wearing of gloves and the wearing of a red necktie are almost universal with high-class fairies. I proclaim myself as a female impersonator through always wearing white kids and large red neck bow with fringed ends hanging down over my lapels. Of a fairy who was arrested for accosting on the street, I have heard it said he got 30 days for wearing a red tie. He's a bird in a gill. On the Rialto, Jennie June fell in love. Her romantic interest was Buddy McDonald, a handsome cad and professional card sharper. Buddy demanded $5 for an evening of his company, and Jennie June thought it was worth it. His specialty was fleecing out-of-town rubes. Here's how it worked. Consider, for instance, the gentleman in this picture admiring the nymphs. Buddy would note the old-fashioned clothes and dazed look, the marks of a rube. He would then befriend the visitor, show him the sights, introduce him to his friends, buy him a few drinks, and soon they would all settle down to a friendly card game, and the rube would lose all his money. On their appointed evenings, Jennie June would search all the shady gambling halls until she spotted Buddy and his mark. Then she would nestle by Buddy's side, further confounding the dazzled tourist, who had never heard of the existence of a third sex. Years later, reminiscing, Jennie June wrote some verses about Buddy. I hope you like poetry, because Jennie June wrote a lot. I again in fond memory behold before me pinkish mountain of loveliness tower. Buddy's forma divina, o naturel see, how his charms, yea unmatched, did o'erpower. But Jennie June's idyll with Buddy did not last. She was surprisingly self-aware about it. She said, I had come to be a terrible bore through hanging around his rooms several times a week and demonstrating myself insatiable. Buddy finally flourished a loaded revolver around her head and cried, if you ever speak to me again, or even come into the same room, I will put a bullet through your head. So Jennie June never again saw her pinkish mountain of loveliness.
Everybody loves a baby, that's why I'm in love with you, pretty baby.
Now and then, Jennie June visited Paresis Hall, the most famous female impersonation resort in town. Her first time there was in January of 1895, the last semester of her senior year. Paresis Hall was very notorious. It was one of the sites for out-of-towners who hired guides to take them through New York's underworld. It was located a short stroll from the Rialto, at the spot where Cooper Square joins the Bowery. In front, Jennie June tells us, was a modest bar room. Behind, a small beer garden. Upstairs were small rooms for rent. A circle of friends, Jennie June calls them the Cercle Hermaphroditoi, rented one of the rooms permanently to use for changing into their feminine finery. Paresis Hall was regularly denounced from the pulpit and raided by the police, so its wicked ways are amply documented. But Jennie June is the only one to describe it from the androgyne point of view. She informs us that the habitués abhorred that nickname because Paresis was a term for insanity. They called it simply the Hall. Here let me mention that female impersonation was not at all novel or shocking in the 1890s. Vaudeville was full of female impersonators. The most successful female impersonator ever was Julian Eltinge. He played only female roles. But in publicity pictures, he practiced the manly art of fisticuffs. The vaudeville female impersonators, after all, were actors. They performed on stage and were obviously play acting. The androgynes in the hall were threatening because they were in earnest. They did not perform on a stage. They mingled with the high flyers and tourists in the bar room and beer garden and in the small rooms upstairs. Jennie June described a typical evening at the hall. It is about 8 o'clock on an evening of April 1895. She is upstairs in the private room with the hermaphroditoi, who are changing into gowns and busy with padding and powder puff. They chatter about the latest fashions. Phyllis, who is in the millinery business, describes the robes and hats she picks out for a certain star actress. Nothing could be more beautiful, Phyllis declares, than a feminine face framed in a picture hat, set sideways, with the rim reaching below the shoulders. But the chatter is interrupted by the entrance of Miss Nighty, who had once been a female impersonator on the vaudeville stage before becoming thick-set. Miss Nighty, someone calls. Queenie and I want you to coach us in female impersonation. Next Friday at the masked ball, we make our debut. And so the good-natured banter continues until the androgynes are ready to descend the stairs to mingle with the young bloods and the high flyers and the tourists. But the free and easy times did not last. A reform mayor took over City Hall in 1895, and he appointed an energetic young politician named Theodore Roosevelt as police commissioner. Paresis Hall was an obvious target. Jennie June reports, even while I was an habitué, the church and the press carried on such a war against the resort that the not-care-a-damn politicians who ruled little old New York had finally to stage a spectacular raid. After this, the resort turned the cold shoulder on androgynes and tolerated the presence of none in feminine garb. Another event of 1895 was Oscar Wilde's trial for gross indecency. Wilde was sent to prison for 2 years. Morality was on the march. The most militant reformer was Anthony Comstock, secretary of the New York Society for the Suppression of Vice. He got Congress to pass the Comstock Law, making it a crime to send lewd and lascivious material through the U.S. mail. And then the post office appointed him as special agent to enforce the Comstock Law. He destroyed 15 tons of books and some 4 million pictures. He even destroyed medical textbooks because of their anatomy illustrations. Naturally, Comstock detested the Hoffman House nymphs, but they were protected by Grover Cleveland. However, he did manage to keep Hoffman House cigars from the U.S. mails. During all this time, Ralph, we are switching for a while to Jennie June's everyday identity, Ralph Werther. During all this time, Ralph applied himself diligently to his studies, and in the spring of 1895, he graduated cum laude with a concentration in modern languages. He did so well that he went on to postgraduate studies. Columbia was now a university thanks to the leadership of its progressive president, Seth Low. And that wasn't all. Columbia's beautiful new Beaux-Arts campus was rising in Morningside Heights, clustered around the imposing dome of, yes, the Seth Low Memorial Library, modeled after the Baths of Diocletian and built with the aid of a $3 million donation from Seth Low. In his second year of graduate school, Ralph consulted a new doctor, once again hoping to be cured of inversion, and the autobiography tells what followed. He happened to number the president of the university among his friends and whispered to him that I ought not to be continued as a student. I was immediately expelled. I earned my living in a minor capacity at the university, and expulsion also meant that my income was cut off. But I did not have the courage to return to my village home. So Ralph looked for a job, but there was a problem. I could not name as reference any member of the university or let it be known that I had been a student there. I called on 2 professors and asked if I could refer to them. One replied, "I could not recommend you for any position, however menial." The other, "You must realize that you are outcast from society." In a few weeks, I was penniless and a shelterless wanderer on the streets in midwinter. I was driven for shelter to the Bowery, because there alone, lodging could be obtained for 15 cents and a big meal of coarse and even disgusting food for 10 cents. Jennie June now found herself in exactly the situation she had dreaded, given up to a life of shame in the slums. The Bowery was the entertainment district of the lower classes. It was only 2 blocks from Jennie June's old haunts on Mulberry Street, and it was frequented by the recent immigrant groups, the Italians, the Irish, and the Jews. By night, it was ablaze with electric lights, and deafening with the roar of the 3rd Avenue L and the clatter of streetcars below. Yet there were compensations. Jennie June wrote, "Living as I was now compelled to live, and necessarily mingling daily with men of loose morals, the charm of masculine beauty proved more powerful than ever before. Of course, she somehow had to make some money. I know what you are thinking, but no. Even in my present extreme poverty," she said, "I was decidedly averse to making a gainful occupation out of the life. I wanted my freedom of action and was unalterably opposed to intimacy for pecuniary gain with anyone whom I did not adore." And that is all she tells us in the autobiography. But elsewhere she reveals that she survived by busking. She touches up eyebrows with a stick of charcoal. She paints her cheeks with rouge. She applies padding and wig and picture hat and slips into a gown. Then she makes her way to a low-class cabaret, where she performs the routine she perfected in the ladies' parlor of the Hotel Comfort, the prima donna, the crybaby. And when she takes her bows, the quarters and dimes roll to her feet. And that is how she supports herself and her thuggish boyfriend, who spends all day at crap shooting.
Wait till the sun shines, Nellie, when the clouds go.
At this point, Jennie June's narrative makes a very abrupt transition. These are her words. I have now reached a period of my life lasting over 2 years, during which it was my luck to serve as private secretary to a millionaire septuagenarian living in the suburbs of the metropolis. How this happened, she does not explain, but it is not likely that she found a millionaire septuagenarian on the Bowery. Her time as a Bowery coquette lasted only 9 weeks, the winter of 1896-97. So her time as a private secretary would have been 1897-98. She was a live-in assistant in the millionaire's mansion, but there is no hint of impropriety, and millionaire septuagenarians were not Jennie June's type. And now we will switch again to referring to our author in his everyday identity as Ralph Werther. Every fortnight, Ralph took one evening off for a female impersonation spree, but the other 13 days were all work. The millionaire took him along on business trips to Europe, where his skill in modern languages was useful. And so this employment gave him time to find his footing and begin to make his way in the world. Be sure to watch part 2 of this biography, describing Ralph's career as a journalist and Jennie June's work as a sex scientist and crusader for gay rights.
Many the hopes that have